Welcome to Economics Applied. I'm Stephen Davis, host of the show. Today we're going to continue my conversation with Jens Ludwig. He's a professor at the University of Chicago, where he directs the university's crime lab. Let's get into solutions, and I want to go through various solutions that come out of your preferred way of thinking. Tell us what they are, and maybe say a word about what we know about the extent to which they work, or they just seem like good ideas but not yet fully tested on the ground.
Let me maybe start off with a sort of a higher level framing point, which is, I would encourage your listeners or viewers to just reflect for themselves for a moment on what they think their own favorite solution is to the crime and gun violence problem in America. So depending on people's politics and their priors, they'll think more prisons, more cops, more early childhood education, more K-12 spending, more drug treatment, more mental health treatment. I'm sure there's some other things that I haven't thought of, but you get the idea. People are walking around
Family
with this
counseling.
People are walking around with whatever this wish list is that they have.
Right.
And I think realistically, if you look at the next 4 years, you should just throw those mental wish lists out the window. Right. If you look at the city of Chicago, let me just use the city of Chicago as an example. Right. We are. Our budget, we're staring down the face of a $1 billion budget deficit for next year that the city has as far as I can tell, has no idea how they're going to close. And you might think maybe they can go to Springfield, Illinois, to the state capitol and ask the state for help. But the state is facing down something like, as I understand it, like a $5 billion budget deficit. And you might think, well, maybe the city of Chicago can go to the federal government for help. And I think if anything, it's going to go in the other direction. The administration is threatening.
I take it the larger point is we need cost-effective ways to reduce gun deaths.
No, not cost-effective, zero-cost ways.
Okay, well.
Let me make this really.
There's always some. You mean zero monetary cost? There's always some cost. You're an economist, so
fair.
Somebody's got to put in time and effort.
Well, let me tell you what I'm gonna argue that there are close to zero cost, even in the way an economist would think about this.
Okay.
All right, let me explain what I mean. So this is just to say, right, like, one sort of conversation that we could be having is, how does this behavioral economics set of solutions compare to your favorite solution? I don't think that's the right conversation, because I don't think what other people have been talking about is even an option in the current fiscal environment. And Chicago's not alone in that, right? Go around the country and look at the financial situation that cities are in. It would be very, very easy to think, boy, we're just screwed. Okay. So I think here's one thing that we can do for starters. Let me go back to the poker player analogy and poker players going on tilt. When you talk to poker players and you ask them, like, how did you get better at playing poker? You might think, it's all about, I learned a new trick for counting cards or whatever. But a lot of what good poker players say is one of the easiest and first ways that they got better at playing poker is they learned to recognize this tendency to go on tilt and to avoid it. And that already is a little bit of a light bulb moment, because it tells you that is something that people can learn. They can learn something about their own thinking. Poker players do it. How do poker players do it? Through trial and error and feedback. Feedback is, I go home at the end of the night and I lost a ton of money at the poker table, and I'm looking at what went wrong. Oh, I was pissed off for 2/3 of the night. Maybe that wasn't so helpful, kind of thing. For a 16-year-old kid growing up in Greater Grand Crossing, trial and error is a hugely difficult and potentially very costly way to learn.
Because you might get shot.
You might get shot.
Or arrested and incarcerated for a long period.
Yeah. And so, we've been working with a bunch of nonprofits and government agencies to study these programs that basically teach young people on the south and west sides of Chicago who are living in the most unforgiving places how to recognize when they go on tilt and how to avoid that. We can get into the details of what they look like, but for let me just say one other thing pragmatically on the policy front for this is a few years ago, we were talking to the administrator of the Cook County Juvenile Temporary Detention Center, this guy, Earl Dunlap, who was running the place because a federal judge had taken it over. He thought it was really terrible and whatever. And so, Earl is like, I have no money to do anything. But the kids would go to school. They'd go to Nancy B. Jefferson, the Chicago Public School, in the morning. And then they'd basically spend the afternoon in the common room watching TV with a guard standing against the wall watching them watch TV. And, Earl was like, I don't have any money to do anything, but I think we can probably figure out how to do something that's more developmentally productive for the afternoon than watching 6 hours of TV. And so we worked with Earl to basically train the detention staff to teach the kids, have the kids go through one of these programs that leads them to recognize when they go on tilt. And Earl was like, this is not going to be the greatest social program in the whole world, right? But it doesn't cost me anything because I've got the guard, I've got the kids, I've got the facility. The marginal cost was like a week of training and the cost of mimeographing the books. And we structured that like a randomized trial, and we see that recidivism goes down by 20%.
Yeah, okay. So, but there's still cost here. There's there may be no monetary cost, but there's got to be people of goodwill. I'm putting you in that category now, who are willing to help these folks out. I think I'm quite sympathetic, not just to the recognizing when you go on tilt and responding to that in a productive way. I've seen that. I spent a few years going to school in a pretty violent neighborhood, so I've seen the phenomenon you describe. The other thing, which is similar in some respects, but not quite the same, is to put young people through different hypothetical situations and help them think through how they would respond. So this is a different type of feedback, but it's like, okay, if you do get in this situation, let's think about it in advance. And hopefully then they'll take a more system 2-like response to the situation than a system 1 response. Yeah,
that's what all of these programs at heart are, like giving kids a chance. Like they're putting them in the best versions of these programs are putting kids in scenarios where they can trial and error and feedback in sort of very low stakes situations so that they're more prepared out on the street.
So I'm a fan of that kind of thing, but those are not. I don't see those as low cost. They may be lower cost than some of the things we do now, but it takes skill to execute that, and you either need to have volunteers who are willing to do it, or you got to pay people.
Yeah, well, here's what I mean by low cost, which is I think a lot of the institutions that we have built for young people have low opportunity cost time built into them, right? And that's why I tell the story about like the kids watching 6 hours of TV. Like the cost, set aside the training cost for the moment. The opportunity cost literally is the guard standing against the wall watching the kids versus the guard standing in front of the room having them do activities. That's as close to zero cost as we could ever get.
Because you're saying, look, we've already allocated a lot of resources to do something with these kids. We're not using those resources very well. We can just reorient what's happening in those situations, like the kids, instead of them watching TV for 6 hours, they're engaged in these role-playing, scenario thinking type approach to help them navigate the challenges they will actually face in their lives later on. So that's what you mean by low or zero cost.
Yeah, exactly. And let me just give you one other example of low opportunity cost time with an institution that works with tons of young people. So I went to Lenape High School in Medford, New Jersey, and the state of New Jersey in its wisdom, if I remember correctly, this was back in the 1890s, so it was a long time ago. I might be misremembering a little bit. I believe that I was required by the state of New Jersey to take 4 years of health education. And here's what I recall the health education curriculum being. It was eat more broccoli, sleep 8 hours a night, don't drink alcohol because it's bad for you, and here's where babies come from. Right?
It took you 4 years to get all that.
It took me 4 years to get all of that. That is very low. It's basically telling kids things that they are either for sure going to ignore or they already know. And
well, that's to my point about skill. You know, if you're a 35-year-old social worker and you come into a class with a bunch of 14 and 15-year-olds, it takes some skill to get their attention and keep them engaged.
Yeah, but I mean, let me go back to the juvenile detention. Like, the guards were not hired for their ability to deliver social programs to kids.
Understood.
And this is not some boutique hothouse like ideal pilot program. It's like, Earl Dunlap took the guards who were there, trained them, and it was like, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And
you're
I don't
saying it was effective. This is an RCT?
This was an RCT.
Okay, well,
yeah, it was an RCT.
Okay, that's impressive, and you're making me revise my assessment a bit.
And I don't believe that health teachers, if you look at the leading causes of death to adolescents in the United States, it's homicide, especially in low-income minority communities. It's suicide, it's drug overdoses, and it's motor vehicle accidents. It's basically deaths of decision-making.
Yeah, these are all things that are potentially quite responsive to the kind of program you're describing.
Exactly. And so why aren't we, and these programs only take something like 15 to 20 hours. If you've got kids for 4 years in health education, why are we not carving out a month of classes over those 4 years to do this?
What was the old, there have been failed campaigns along these lines too. I'm trying to remember what the slogan was, just say no. These things have to be done with in a way that resonates with the audience.
For sure.
That's the point I'm trying to make.
For sure. Yeah, totally agree. There's always a bad way to do everything. I totally agree.
So this is one class of interventions,
yeah.
and I'm going to summarize it. It's a combination of two things, and tell me if I've got it wrong. To young people, recognizing when you're going on tilt and how you should respond. And second, thinking through in advance some situations that might relate to situations you actually will face in your everyday life that could be fraught with danger, but thinking in advance, what would be a better way to respond?
Yeah, I think it's the one and the same. It's one and the same.
Those are the same.
It's putting kids in scenarios and having them see themselves go on tilt and then say, okay, now you recognize that you were just in this scenario and you went on tilt. Now let's step back and think about alternative ways that what was the trigger for you to go on tilt? Now when you're in the real world, what do you do? That sort of thing.
So I think I agree with you. This is a potentially very productive approach. It can be done poorly or well. So that's one. So give me another one.
Yeah, and I just want to underscore too, like, we have the capacity to deliver that at huge scale. We spend $800 billion on public schools and another $100 billion on detention facilities, which by definition are touching the highest risk people. We could infuse, okay.
I agree with that, but I just want to inject a note of not skepticism, but caution. There are a lot of good ideas that when the government tries to scale up, don't work. So I'll give you an example in a different context. We can all imagine situations in which somebody's lost their job, and with some useful retraining could gain new skills, hopefully skills that complement the ones they already had, that would then make them an attractive candidate for reemployment. So I accept that. On the other hand, I think it's fair to say of the many, many federally supported job retraining programs, most of them haven't worked very well. So this is a standard caution. You're well aware of this. Scaling up interventions that work very well in limited settings is often a lot more challenging than it appears.
Yeah, totally. I totally agree with that. I think, you know the economics research as well as I do on the returns to schooling. We have this $800 billion a year public school system that generates whatever the annual rate of return is for an extra year of school. Maybe a better school system could generate a higher rate of return, but we're doing something right at large scale. I totally get the caution, but why aren't we trying to infuse this stuff there? Okay, great. So the next one. I think that the next thing that we could be doing with almost no additional resources, is to do a much better job of positioning the eyes on the street that cities are currently employing in the times and places when gun violence is most likely to happen, right? Because I think I think what is underappreciated in practice, like every criminologist knows this, but when you look at what cities do in practice, I think practice does not look like it is taking this idea very seriously. There is an enormous amount of predictability in the time and place when gun violence will happen. Let me just give you one example. There's a liquor store on the south side of Chicago at 57th and State Street that is open until midnight. And almost every other liquor store on the south side is open only until 9 or 10 p.m. Why is that liquor store open until midnight? My uninformed hypothesis is maybe there's an alder person with a speedboat that is connected to this somehow. I don't know, but nonetheless it is. So what happens on the south side of Chicago up until 9 or 10 is that everybody goes to their local liquor store to buy their booze. They're going with the people that they grew up with, they know, they like. And around 9 or 10 o'clock, what happens, it's sort of the witching hour. Everyone from the south side of Chicago, I've got a beef with you over in this other neighborhood because your girlfriend said this thing to my sister and the whatever, and we're pissed off and whatever. And at 10 o'clock, we all converge to 57th and State
And
Street.
we may have been drinking for a couple hours already.
We may
ran out. That's why we got to
may
make
well
a
have
run.
been drinking for a couple hours up until 10 and ran out. So we show up at 57th and State, liquored up with a bunch of grudges against other people from all over the South Side. And guess what the data shows for what happens between 10 p.m. and midnight at 57th and State? A bunch of terrible things. And, I think partly for political reasons, cities have become a little ambivalent about using data to target where they put police officers and where they put violence interrupters. I think it is. I think it is a concern that the data will lead to rising disparities and where police spend their time. I think in practice, that's not what the data say actually happened. The Los Angeles Police Department did a randomized control trial of what happens when you use data to target predictive policing to hotspots. And there's no change in the racial composition of who's arrested when you do that. But I've talked to the UCLA professor who helped build the targeting tool, and he tells me he was shocked.
This guy generated a huge controversy with this algorithmic approach to policing.
Yeah. But essentially what it is doing is finding the liquor stores from 10 to 12. That's concretely what's going on, and you can see very concretely why that would be so useful. And you can see in the data the overwhelming majority of people who would benefit, whose lives would be saved, would be in minority communities where the gun violence problem is disproportionately concentrated. And so I say that is like something that cities need to take more seriously, because in the grand scheme of things, using data to build statistical models to figure out how to deploy your people, it is not free, but it is truly a rounding error compared to what we're spending on police and violence interrupters and all this other stuff.
This one is really a striking example of how the political process can impede what seem like common sense solutions or improvements on how we manage the threat of gun violence. And some of this does happen less formally, I think. I mean, Chicago is a place where the summer evenings can often be hot and uncomfortable. And it's well known that Friday and Saturday and Sunday evenings, maybe as well, in the summertime, especially if it's hot, unpleasant, gun violence goes up, often among young people in lower income neighborhoods. So the police know that. I mean, it's not, even I know it just casually reading the newspaper. So I presume they have more officers on the street in the evening on hot summer nights than they would otherwise. So this happens to some extent anyway.
Yeah, it does happen to some extent. And, both in terms of staffing levels, the staffing levels go up when the gun violence surges. You're right. It's still imperfect. The shifts end too early relative to when the gun violence extends later in the evening than the surge in staffing. There's some things that you can fix. But it's also the case that when the Los Angeles Police Department experiment that I mentioned, the treatment condition there, the intervention condition, was use a statistical model to decide where to deploy people. The control condition was not nothing. The control condition was extra cops allocated through human intuition. And when you look at the maps,
Okay, so you're comparing to this, at least in this particular case, it's being compared to the informal allocation of resources that was already happening.
Yeah, exactly. And relative to that alternative or that counterfactual, the statistical model deployment winds up doing something like doubling the amount of crime prevention you get from an existing level of police resources. So it's not small, right? This is not a small thing.
That's a huge effect from, you're right, for a city of the scale of Los Angeles, this is really a pittance, the cost of developing this model if the data are already in hand. So help me understand better, what is the political resistance to this? Remind me, because I've sort of forgotten. Why was this so politically controversial?
Yeah, it is the intersection of a couple things that lots of people don't like. So it involves the police for start, even though like
it involves the police.
Involves the police for starters, even though in principle you could also target violence interrupters, it's not just targeting police. So we built a violence reduction dashboard for the city of Chicago. It's on City Hall's website that nonprofits all over the city use. So the use of data in general need not be synonymous with just policing. So,
right.
But nonetheless, it's been associated with police. I think the other thing is there's been a kind of anti-technology kind of movement as well, with a bunch of, I think that's partly fueled through examples of technology being used in unhelpful ways that have exacerbated racial disparities in a bunch of areas. And so I think part of the problem here maybe is like, we don't have anything quite like an FDA for public policy, where, like, as you know, the FDA doesn't let, Pfizer or any drug company give anybody any sort of pill before it's been subject to a randomized trial so we know it works. We don't have that for anything that the government does in the policy sphere. And so going to your point of like government implementation is sometimes good and sometimes bad, I can see why people would be nervous about bad implementation. Now, in LA, they showed us that it's possible to do this with good implementation, but I can understand why people would be worried about whether we're going to get good implementation everywhere. And I think figuring out some way to solve that problem would be good for the world, but also potentially create sort of a political tailwind for this idea as well.
Okay. So give me one more quickly, and we'll wrap up this conversation. One more type of solution. You've given us two big ones already.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe the one other one that I would give is it's related to the idea of getting eyes on the street.
Eyes on the street.
And it's to recognize that there are a bunch of things that cities are doing that can enhance or impede eyes on the street in neighborhoods and have really big effects on gun violence through policy levers that you might never associate with gun violence. And so let me just give you one example. These really clever people at the University of Pennsylvania did a study, a randomized trial a few years ago in partnership with the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia, like Chicago, like lots of American cities, has tons and tons of abandoned vacant lots. Like you walk around the south side of Chicago, these are just tons of trash, overgrown grass, needles, little empty heroin baggies, like you name it, they're all over the place. They're not very inviting. You live on a block where you've got a lot of this. It's just not an inviting. Okay. So they worked with the city of Philadelphia to randomly select abandoned lots to clean up. And this is something that the Cook County Land Bank is doing to some degree right now. I don't know if you're familiar with that. They're funding the cleanup of these vacant lots and turning them into nice little pocket parks. In Philadelphia, you could see when you take an abandoned, scary vacant lot and you turn it into a pocket park, the survey data show you that people spend more time out in public, and the police data show you that in low-income neighborhoods, shootings in that vicinity go down by something like 20 or 30%.
Oh, wow. Okay.
That is not a small effect.
No, it's not.
That is not a small effect, right?
It's interesting.
And similarly, we have, like, the Cook County Land Bank is doing that. Why aren't we doing more of that? Like, we've got other natural experiments from places that show that when you make it easier to zone in stores. So you've got more commercial that generates more foot traffic that reduces violence. So there's a bunch of stuff like this that sits outside the criminal justice space that shapes the social and built environment in neighborhoods. Like 10, 20, 30% reductions in crime. You start stacking these things up, that leads to really, really big changes.
It also makes it just a much more pleasant place to live. So
And that,
that
yes,
too.
and that, exactly.
All right. So you've given us three very different categories of policy prescriptions that flow out of the research that you and others have done.
And none of which makes sense under conventional wisdom, it should be noted, right?
Well, I mean, I'd push back a little bit on that. Just eyes on the street, for example, alters the cost-benefit calculations of premeditated crime as well.
Tell me, I've been looking at what the major political candidates for president have been saying for 100 years about crime and violence in America. I've heard a lot about gun control. I've heard a lot about prisons, a lot about social programs.
I'm not endorsing any of that.
I'm just saying this is an idea that is not in the certainly not in the conventional wisdom in the public discussion.
I'm making a different point, which is the three kinds of ideas that you talked about, especially the second two, I think, they're not just good from a system one thinking perspective, but they also do have some benefits. Maybe they're much smaller if you think gun violence is motivated by rational cost-benefit considerations. You're less likely to commit an armed robbery on the street when there are more eyes on the street, because it's more likely that somebody else will see you, identify you, lead to arrest and incarceration. So to put it another way, the ideas you're talking about, I think, are good ones, regardless of whether people fully agree with your diagnosis of what the problem is. And there's a robustness feature to these policy prescriptions that I like.
Point taken. Thank you.
Okay, well, this has been a great discussion. Your book, again, it's The Unexpected Origins of American Gun Violence, Unforgiving Places. I guess Unforgiving Places is the title. I just read the subtitle first. It's out now. It came out 2 days before this podcast taping on April 23rd. It's a lot of fun to read. It's not dry, even though it makes some important points. So I hope lots of people will read it and benefit from its insights.
Thanks very much. Thanks so much again for having me on.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.